Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. You know those four chords? Like those four chords, the ones that are supposedly in every hit song. They sound like this. And it's true that this loop, often called the axis progression, is the backbone of hundreds of hits in pop, rock, and other genres, but why? What makes these four chords so special, and how did they come to so thoroughly dominate the popular music landscape? Obviously, I'm far from the first person to ask this question, but four-chord loops are an area that I've done a fair amount of work in, so I figured it was time I took a shot at answering it. Let's talk about chords. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Before we get started, there's one thing I have to get out of the way first. I've been working on this video since December, but 2 weeks ago, fellow YouTuber Patricia Taxon released her own video about four-chord loops, including a discussion of the axis progression. This is actually the second time this has happened to me with video topics in the last couple months. The other one I shelved for unrelated reasons, but this time I decided to just go ahead and make the video anyway because I think I still have something worth saying. That said, Patricia's video is really good, so I'll put a link in the description, and once you're done here, if you still want more chord loop content, I highly recommend watching it. Anyway, in order to understand the axis progression, I think we have to start with another similar chord loop, the Duop Changes. This is an incredibly classic progression, and to be clear, I mean that literally. Like, these days we tend to associate it most strongly with the pop music of the 50s and 60s, but classical composers have been using it for centuries. Heck, Mozart used it in his Piano Sonata No. 8, among other places. And that shouldn't be surprising. These are the four most important chords in G major. In fact, if we ignore E minor for a second, these three are what's called the primary triads because they literally define the shape of the key. G major is built out of these three chords, and if that's not enough, they're even arranged in the most traditionally satisfying way possible. In classical theory, the guiding principle is that different chords in a key have different functions or jobs to do, and that good chord progressions use chords with the right functions in the right order to create a compelling sense of motion, and that's exactly what the Duop Changes do. We start on the 1 chord, which has tonic function, meaning it provides a sense of rest. It's our home base. Then we go to 6 minor, which also has tonic function, introducing a new harmonic color while extending that calm, restful sound. After that comes the 4 chord, which has subdominant function, which means its job is to introduce instability, increasing the tension in the progression. And finally, we got the 5 chord with dominant function, which is even more unstable, but more importantly, it's also directional. It points you back to the 1 chord. This clear linear rise in tension throughout the progression leads to an incredibly satisfying resolution when we return to the tonic, and the whole loop is built to maximize that sense of release. All of the weight of these 4 chords lands heavily on the first one. But when it comes to loops, that's not necessarily great. Modern chord loops aren't really trying to have one big resolution. They're more designed to create a musical atmosphere with relatively constant motion. Releasing all the tension at once gives you an awkward pause, a moment where everything seems to stop, interrupting our smooth harmonic flow with a single dramatic event. That's why as the chord loop rose in prominence, we saw a decline in the use of the Duop Changes. They never went away completely. Heck, Taylor Swift used it in her 2019 single Me, so clearly they're not entirely obsolete, but these days they tend to feel a little old-fashioned because most of the other loops we hear are structured pretty differently. Still, like I said, these are the 4 most important chords in any major key, so it'd be great if we could find a way to use them that was a bit more in line with modern loop practice, and fortunately the fix is pretty simple. We just take this 5 chord and drop it over here instead. This does 3 things. First, it pushes the 6 minor into the 3rd position. After the 1st chord, the 3rd is the strongest metric point in the loop, so which chord we put there matters a lot. In the Duop Changes, it was the 4 chord, a subdominant sound, creating instability that wanted to work its way back to the stable tonic, but now we've got the 6 there instead, which is itself a tonic function chord. We're effectively seesawing back and forth between our primary tonic G and our secondary tonic E minor, with both points feeling relatively stable. But it's more than that. We're also now resolving to the 6 chord. Again, the 5 chord is a directional sound that wants to go back to the tonic. Usually this means going to 1, but 6 minor is also a tonic function chord, so we can resolve there too. This is called the deceptive resolution because it's kinda like a 5-1, but with a bit of a fake out. It's not quite as strong as the 5-1 resolution, but in the Duop Changes we were approaching this chord by 3rd, which isn't a resolution at all, so this is still a significant upgrade. And lastly, we've weakened the resolution to the 1 chord. Instead of ending on a 5-1 resolution, nicknamed the authentic cadence because of how strong it sounds, we end on a plagal cadence or 4-1 resolution. This is a much more characteristic sound in rock and pop. Going from 4 to 1 still feels like an arrival, but it doesn't have the same sense of finality to it, so it doesn't interrupt the harmonic flow. Taken together, these 3 changes result in a secondary tonic that's much closer in prominence to the primary tonic, taking some of the weight off the shoulders of the 1 chord and allowing for more consistent motion throughout the loop. Now, instead of spending all our time setting up a big resolution to 1, we're alternating between 2 smaller resolutions, each of which feels comfortable, but neither neither of which feels complete. And that has profound implications for how the loop is used, like the Duop Changes almost always starts at the beginning. We have a tendency to hear the first chord in a section as the one chord, and since the loop is so clearly telling us which chord that is, it feels strange to find it anywhere else. If I start playing it on 6 minor, and let that loop for a little while, it pretty quickly shifts to sounding like it starts on the G chord anyway. The E minor just isn't stable enough, so without any other metric cues, your ear just makes the adjustment to the thing it assumes is supposed to be happening. Okay, I'm gonna stop it now. But if I do the same thing with the axis progression, starting on 6 minor, and letting it run, something different happens. Your ear just sort of accepts E minor as the real one chord and starts reading everything else in that key. Instead of being 6, 4, 1, 5, it's 1, flat 6, flat 3, flat 7. Both modes are stable. This means that we're actually sort of dealing with two different progressions at the same time, which I'll call the major axis and the minor axis, and the power of this loop comes in no small part from its ability to play with the boundaries between these different tonalities. The reason this works so well, though, is because of the interaction of a couple different biases we tend to have when listening to chord loops. The first one is something we've already mentioned, first chord bias. That is, we tend to assume that the first chord we hear is the one chord. It's the most metrically significant position, so naturally it's where the most harmonically important chord belongs. Next up is major scale bias. Western popular music has historically been mostly written in major, so when we hear a new song, we tend to hear it as major until we find a good reason not to. This is amplified by primary chord bias, where we assume the chords we're hearing are important ones in the key. As we said, 3 of the 4 chords in the axis progression are the 3 primary triads the major scale is built out of, whereas in minor, they're mostly just some chords. This makes it a much stronger tonal progression in major, even if the order of the chords makes it not quite as strong as the Duop Changes. But functional tonality isn't the only way to think about harmony. Regular viewers of the channel may remember that last year I published some of my own scholarship on the harmony of 4-chord loops using a pretty different approach. I'll put a link to the video in the description, but the short version is this. Instead of considering how each chord fits within a larger key, we just look at how each chord fits with the ones on either side. To keep things simple, I decided to break these relationships up into 2 categories. Setups, where the motion from one chord to the next is strong, and not setups, where the motion is weak. I define strong harmonic motion as moving either by perfect fifth, like the authentic or plagal cadence, or by step like the deceptive cadence, and weak motion is anything else. Looking at where the setups are in a loop helps you determine how the harmonic weight is distributed, which gives you a better sense of how it wants to behave. In that video, I laid out 4 possible chord functions, but for our purposes, I only care about 2. The signpost, which doesn't get set up, but does set up the next chord, and the destination, which is the opposite, getting set up and then not setting anything else up after. Effectively, the signpost starts a chain of resolutions that ends up at a destination. Most loops have one of each. In the Duop Changes, the signpost is the 4-chord, which passes through the 5 before resolving to 1, our final destination. Because the signpost and destination are opposite each other, the Duop Changes are what I call a piston loop with a steady rise and fall to its harmonic motion. The axis progression, on the other hand, is a cascade loop, which means the signpost is right after the destination, making the chain of resolutions as long as possible. The whole loop feels like it's falling down toward a single point, and despite what you might assume if you're used to the major axis, that final destination is actually the minor tonic. It's the only chord that doesn't set up the next one, instead approaching it by major third, and since it's our only destination, we're inclined to hear it as the 1 chord. Now, on something like the Duop Changes, all these biases align. Major scale bias and destination bias both point us to the same place, and first chord bias just tags along, giving us only one real form for the loop. But on the axis progression, major scale bias and destination bias disagree, leaving first chord bias to serve as a tiebreaker. We can put either one in the strongest metric position, and whichever one we do is probably going to sound like the 1 chord. In fact, because of that flexibility, we can actually play around even more. Around the mid-2000s, we started to see the rise of a third form of the axis progression, beginning on the 4. That said, I'd argue that harmonically speaking, this form is unstable. If I loop it for a while, it pretty quickly collapses to one of our main axes, at least to my ears. I don't really hear that C as the 1 chord. If we sprinkle in some extra metric and melodic cues, though, it can totally work. The classic example is Umbrella by Rihanna, But listening to that makes it clear to me that this isn't really an entirely new axis. G flat may be the first chord, but it doesn't really feel like the one chord. The melody and the harmony both seem to settle on B flat as the root, and that makes sense. It's our destination, one of the two possible tonics, and while it's not the first chord, it's still in a stronger metric position than D flat, the other tonic option, so it wins. Somewhat surprisingly though, we almost never see the other variant form starting on the 5 chord. In his paper on the axis progression, Dr. Mark Richards only identified a handful of examples of this, most notably Wannabe by the Spice Girls. If you want my future, forget my past. Which is actually really interesting, because the melody seems to emphasize neither tonic, instead settling on D sharp, a note that's equally relevant in both chords. In theory, this should behave just like the other variant, with the final chord, in this case B, becoming the primary tonic due to its stronger metric position, and if we look at the other sections of the song, that does appear to be what's happening, but that weird floating melody may actually help explain why this version is so rare. If I had to guess, I'd say that destination bias is probably a bit stronger than major scale bias, so burying the destination in the weakest metric position makes it hard to stabilize anywhere. Without a strong first chord to lean on, the progression winds up floating in the space between the two tonics because it can't quite justify either one. But while it's strongest in this form, that ambiguity is present in pretty much every instance of the axis progression. The major axis always has a shade of minor and vice versa, which is part of what makes this loop so much more complex than the Duop Changes. You can use external cues like the melody and other song sections to try to figure out which axis you're using, but more often than not, you're kinda using both at once, which isn't something we see much of in traditional harmony, but it's a really common thing in chord loops. Overall, I think the axis progression is a great introduction to loop theory. It's familiar enough that most musicians can start to explain it, but with enough open questions that they can't explain it completely without learning some new tools along the way. Really understanding the axis progression requires understanding not just functional harmony, but also harmonic weight, metric positioning, tonal flexibility, and a whole lot more. It's a perfect encapsulation of so many modern ideas about chords, all wrapped up in a really simple looking package, and while some folks might say it's overused, I think it's worth recognizing just how many different ways there are to use it. It's actually kind of funny that I got to reference the Spice Girls in this because my friend Alex recently learned about them for the first time. He even documented the experience in a video over on Nebula. You see, Alex is 19, and whenever he hangs out with the rest of the Nebula crowd, we wind up grilling him on pop culture stuff we all grew up with and he's never heard of, so eventually we decided to just turn that into a series. It's called Alex Goes Bananas, and every episode a different creator challenges him to learn about and explain a band, movie, or other piece of pop culture from the 90s. I made him listen to Rob Zombie, and he's also covered Limp Bizkit, Moulin Rouge, and at the request of Vanessa from Braincraft, he's even learned about the Spice Girls. It's a really fun series whether you know these bands yourself or you're just learning along with him. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Nebula is a streaming service built by some of YouTube's top educators, including Adam Neely, Lindsay Ellis, Legal Eagle, and for some reason me, and there's all sorts of great original videos exclusively available on Nebula. And it gets even better. We've worked out a deal where if you sign up for CuriosityStream with the link in the description, not only will you get over 40% off their annual plan, you'll also get a Nebula account for as long as you remain a CuriosityStream member. I honestly can't believe they agreed to this. For less than $12 a year, you'll get access not just to Nebula, but also CuriosityStream's entire library, including personal favorites like Can a Computer Write a Hit Musical, which, I mean, I think the title does a good job telling you what that's about, but still, it's really fun. Again, link in the description, $12 for the entire year. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patrons, Susan Jones and Jill Sundgaard. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.